First of all, Rabbi Zwickler, you did a masterful job, so there isn't that much left for me to say. But let me start. Point number one is that I want to laud you all for being here. This is not an easy talk to come to. You know, I always think, I don't know that I would come to such a talk. You know, it's a weekday night. It's in the middle of the summer. It's a hot day. It was a rainy day. And it's such an unpleasant topic that our gut feeling would normally tell us to stay away. There's interesting research on abuse prevention. It shows that nights like tonight, if we get your anxiety level up too high, okay, it's not good, because it actually will lessen the chance of effectively being able to protect our children. If we keep it too low, it's certainly not good. So we have to find that middle kind of path that we know is what Jewish hashkafa tells us is the way we should go, is for that shvil hazav. But hopefully by the end of tonight, you won't be so anxious that you walk out of here depressed. Hopefully you'll walk out of here somewhat energized and inspired. So that's point number one. Point number two is the obvious point, and that's that, as you've been hearing, usually abuse comes at the hand of people we know. It's hardly ever somebody who's a complete stranger. It's often somebody we know from the neighborhood, or somebody we know, God forbid, but it's a harsh reality in our family, be it a cousin or an uncle or an aunt or a direct family member. And that's very, very hard to see, okay? And it's a painful fact, but that's just beyond a shadow of a doubt what happens. I don't know what percentage of situations that the organizations represented here are working with is intrafamilial, but I would imagine, without even asking, that it's well more than half of what you're dealing with, right? Is that true? In terms of, right? Is Amudim more than half? It's in the family? Huh? 87%. That's even more than half. Okay. 87%. Is that true, Michal? 87%. Okay. See? So I have to. Okay. There's such a specific percentage, but
we just did the study this morning.
I know. I got it. Okay. Or actually, as I was speaking. No. One of the nice things Amudim does is actually very, very careful record keeping, and they really do know what's happening. And I see from Rabbi Bleischer that Project Sarah, it's up there, and that's hard to see. So let me tell you. A study and a story, okay? So I want to speak to your right hemispheres a little bit, as you know I do, okay? Here's the study. It's a study I did years ago, and I think it's this study actually was used in congressional hearings on sex abuse prevention. It was a study that I conducted with some colleagues probably about 25 years ago. And I'm not saying it to horrify you. I'm just saying it because it's why I'm so passionate about nights like tonight. Years ago, there was a bus driver of the preschool bus run on Long Island who pled guilty to abusing 80 preschoolers on his bus run. He pulled to the back of the local Sears in Long and abused kids on the bus, okay? And none of the kids disclosed. It came out in some serendipitous way. He was also abusing one of his daughters, who couldn't take it anymore when he started to abuse her younger sister. She went to the police. The police thought, oh my God, this is the guy who's the local bus driver. And they actually followed him and were able to ultimately convict him on 80 counts of abuse. At the time, I was director of psychology at a large hospital system on Long Island. And we had a specialized abuse treatment center. And so I was seeing a lot of these kids in group therapy, and psychologists and other therapists working with me were also seeing them. And I was actually learning something that horrified me as I was seeing these kids. I learned that, and I was able to show from court records and attendance records, that the following thing happened a number of times. They were given a really good film on abuse prevention in their school. It was a Winnie the Pooh film, okay? But it was done by Disney and it was well done. It had all the elements of effective abuse prevention. Then a school nurse came and told them what to do if somebody touched them inappropriately. And then that very day, I was able to show from school records and I was able to show from court records, they went on the bus and were abused and not a single kid disclosed. So the study we did was a very simple study. We interviewed the kids and we said in a nice way, these are little 4 or 5-year-old kids, what were you thinking? You know, the film told you what to do. The film even said, even if it's somebody who works in your school, why didn't you disclose? Do you know that the top reason, among others, but the top reason was they looked at me like I was out of my mind when I asked these kids this question. They said, tell my parents the disgusting things that Mr. Bob did to me. My parents would kill me. Now, I worked with those parents. I knew those parents. I came to know them over the course of the years that we worked with these victims. And they were great parents. They were loving. They were wonderful. But none of them had ever talked to their kids about the danger of abuse. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time with you, giving you very specific guidelines on how to talk to kids without frightening them too much about abuse, the same way that you talk about any kind of safety. You talk about fire safety on Hanukkah, water safety during the summer. So you talk about personal safety as well. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. But that's story number one. That's why I'm so passionate about a night like tonight. Because if it gets even some of you to override your hesitation and talk to your kids about this stuff, I see it truly works. It truly works. So that's point number one. Point number two is a personal story. It's going to sound at the beginning of this story like I'm an idiot. I'm sorry, no. I end up being an idiot. It's going to sound at the beginning of this story like I'm bragging, okay? And then the end of the story is I come out looking bad. So don't worry that I'm sounding like I'm bragging. Here's the story. A number of years ago, I was doing research on children exposed to domestic violence. I was publishing articles on it. I was on the lecture circuit. What happens when a kid grows up in a home where he sees not only verbal fighting between parents, but where there's actually physical violence? And, so I testified at the trial that actually set the law in federal court, that set the law that today is the law of the land in terms of, the way Child Protective Services people have to deal with kids exposed to domestic violence. And I presented my stuff all over the place, all over the world. And I was pretty young, and I was pretty full of myself about it, okay? Because it felt good because it was making a difference. It wasn't dry research. It was like real, okay. And it was good for my career also. Around the same time, there was a little boy who was hanging around my house a lot. This is the idiot part, okay? He was hanging around my house an awful lot. He would come to my house at least 2 nights a week to do homework with one of my kids, sometimes 3 nights a week. There was hardly a Shabbos that went by that he didn't have a meal with us. He was really a Ben bias. He was a little shy, but it felt good to have him come because his parents were extremely prominent. They lived in a very wealthy part of our community in this multi-million-dollar mansion. You'd read about his family in the front page of the business section of the New York Times. They were a very prestigious, respected family. And it went on like this for a number of years. One day, 3 o'clock in the morning, my doorbell rings. Doorbell to my house rings. And it's this boy's mother. She's in her bathrobe. She's crying. She says, David, can I sleep over tonight? I need to sleep over tonight. I said, what is it? She says, the spiral staircase in my house, in this mansion, it's like literally out of the movies, this mansion, waterfront place. She said, my husband just pushed me down the staircase, and he has guns, David. She says, he has guns, and he says he's going to shoot me. Do you mind if I sleep over? So I run and I call my wife over, who thank God's a lawyer, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to handle this in any other way anyway. And the next day, my wife takes her to court. They get an order of protection, and a whole chain of events take place that end up with actually resilience. This kid actually ended up doing fine. He really did fine. But I didn't hear a word she said after she talked about the guns, because all I could think of, all that would rush through my mind throughout that conversation was, how did I miss it? This boy, practically growing up in my house, met every single symptom on what an abused kid who's growing up exposed to serious domestic violence looks like. And I couldn't see it because I was blind to it because it was too close to me. It was a prominent member of my community. It's very hard to see this when you're too close to it. Quick Dvar Torah. When I was here, did I talk about Ilish? Probably not. I wouldn't have talked about Ilish. Listen to this. Listen to this. It's going to make sense in a minute. I'll give you the take-home message, and then we're going to go on to a couple of other points. Here's the story of Ilish. The Gemara talks about Ilish. Now, Ilish was somebody in the times of the Gemara who was a bird linguist. He spoke bird fluently. He was really good in bird, okay? And he finds himself in prison. I imagine it was during the Roman persecution. So he's in jail. And his cellmate is a non-Jewish guy who also speaks bird, but not nearly as well. Ilish is world-renowned, we know from different sources, in speaking bird. A raven flies into his cell and says, Ilish, run for your life, run for your life. Quickly, run for your life. And Ilish, instead of running for his life, he looks at his cellmate and he says, what did the raven just say? And he said, you know Ilish. He said, run for your life, run for your life. Ilish decides not to listen to the bird because he knows ravens aren't that trustworthy. They're not trustworthy. We never trust a raven. Okay, that's a different program, but just never trust a raven. Then a couple of days later, a dove flies in, and a dove says, run for your life, run for your life. Again, Ilish asks the cellmate, what did the dove say? And he says, you know what he said. He said, run away, run away. Now, doves are trustworthy. So Ilish runs for his life and saves himself. So Rav Akiva Eger asks, and then this is expanded on by Rav Chaim Shmulevitz in a beautiful essay. He asks the following. He says, wait a second. Why did Ilish need to check with somebody who wasn't nearly as expert in speaking bird language? What's that about? So Chaim Shmulevitz in particular gives a brilliant answer. He says, to quote Simon and Garfunkel, two RJJ boys, so I'm allowed to quote them, right? He says, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Remember that? Nobody's going to admit this. I'll admit it. I'm old. I can admit it. A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Meaning that Ilish knew that there was nothing that he wanted more in life than to hear that it was safe to run away. And he knew he couldn't trust himself. So he checked with another person. What's the take-home message of this section of the talk? Very simple. When you are presented with a suspicion, something in your gut saying this isn't right, there's something off here, about a person or about something going on with your child, talk to somebody. I got a call today. That was a very upsetting call to me, and yet I could understand it so well from what I just discussed with you. It was about a very clear abuse situation in a summer camp. It was one of the 3 calls I got today. I'm not up to the level that you guys are, but I still get these calls. So I get a call, and it's about a clear case. A boy called his Rebbe and said, Rebbe, there's a counselor here who's taking pictures of me when I'm not, when I'm in the bathroom or when I'm not dressed, and I feel terrible about it. And I'm afraid, and he's also doing other things, beginning to do things. So it was a clear case of abuse that had to be stopped immediately. So they went, by the time they called me, they had already gone to the head of the camp who said, well, no, that doesn't reach to the level, it's not abuse, because he hasn't touched him yet, okay? I mean, it's as clear-cut abuse as you could get. But I, in the old days, used to get furious at these camp directors who would do it. But all that runs through my head is a combination of Ilish and me, okay? It's hard to think that one of your counselors is capable of something that's clear-cut, black and white abuse, okay? So just to tell yourself that if you're not sure, talk to somebody. There are wonderful organizations in town, okay? So you call the incredible organizations that are here. You could call Amudim, you could call Project Sarah. So talking to your preschooler, here are the main points in talking to your preschooler. Number one, remember, this doesn't have to be any more frightening than any kind of safety stuff is, right? You don't get so frightened when you talk to your kid about water safety. You don't get so frightened when you talk to your kid about how to cross the street. It's not such a big deal. So you talk to them, the worst that'll happen is they'll look at you like you're out of your mind. So what? Let them. It's not a big deal. You talk to them, and just by talking to them, it truly makes it more likely that they're going to come to you. Here are the main components, and you can't mess it up. Remember, this isn't an event, it's a process. Number one, with preschoolers, you know, your mother and father love you. We love you, I'll always love you. Nothing you do will ever take away that love from you. Because abusers almost always play on that. They say, your parents, with that bus story that I told you about, one of the things he told them, this Bob guy, he said, you know something? He said, if you tell your parents what you did, they're not going to believe you, they're going to believe me. I'm a grown-up. And he threatened them. He said, I'm going to come to church during choir practice and shoot your sister or brother. Little kids just believe that kind of stuff, okay? So that's number one. I love you, and you could come. There isn't anything that could possibly that you can't come to me with. I want to hear about all the things that happen in school, all the good things and even the bad things that happen, okay? Then here's the main point. Not a big deal point, but it's a common sense point. There are three kinds of touches. The yes touch, like when mommy or daddy hug you and you feel good. Okay, the no touch, like when your friend hits you, it hurts. And then the I don't know touch. Okay, this is when someone touches you and it doesn't hurt, but it makes you feel funny. Okay. And if someone touches you and you feel funny, say no, go away from them and tell mommy about it. Okay? And then you basically, there's a whole thing here about how to talk to them, but you can't go wrong by just talking about it. And then you do what-ifs with them. You could do what-ifs saying, what if the babysitter we bring in tells you not to tell that she's bringing a friend when you know that she's not allowed to have friends or a boyfriend come with her when she's babysitting? What if your uncle, when he comes over, kisses you, or your aunt kisses you in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable? Not that, God forbid, that's abuse, but you want to get them used to building up the muscle of being able to talk about this stuff, okay? Being able to talk about feeling uncomfortable. What if your uncle tickles you past the point of comfort? Again, none of this is abusive, but you want them to get to the idea that they could come to you in not a chutzpahdik way, but just sort of to say it's fine to complain about adults who make you feel uncomfortable. And just by getting those conversations going, it makes all the difference in the world. You know, a number of years ago, a colleague of mine from Los Angeles told me the following study that he did. He was looking at kids who were part of a sniper shooting in Los Angeles. In 1991, a shooter came onto a school ground and opened fire. It was happening even then. It's not as brand new as we think it is. And some kids were killed. But there were two 9-year-old children who were pinned down by the gunfire, and neither of them was injured, but it was terrifying. One became very symptomatic, even though he was exactly the same level of proximity to the shooter as the one who was resilient. So this psychiatrist at UCLA, who I've worked with, he did a simple study, Dr. Pinus. He interviewed these two 9-year-olds. He said, why is it you're doing so well? He told the kid who was resilient. The kid said, what? He said, remember the shooting a couple of weeks ago? You know, you went through a horrible trauma. Why are you doing so well? I mean, he asked it in a more psychologically sound way. And the kid said, let me tell you something, he said. He said, 2 weeks before, our community had a practice drill on what to do if there's an earthquake. They told us, how do you handle an earthquake? It's Los Angeles. So when the shooting started, I said to myself, oh, this is a little bit like an earthquake. So I knew exactly what to do. I dove for cover, and I knew I'd be okay. Now, he was no safer than the kid next to him, but he felt protected by the community. And it changed the nature of the experience. You know, the research shows that even 1 or 2 simple talks with your kids about safety, it's not going to terrify them. The worst that'll happen is they'll shut you off a little bit, but it shows that even if, God forbid, they're abused, And even if they choose not to tell you, it's going to, in some ways, be protective. That's why I feel so strongly about this. So if all you do when you go home tonight to your kids or to your grandchildren or whatever is you feel a little more open to talking about this stuff to them. And again, there's some wonderful things. There's a wonderful book that Yankee Horowitz put out, about talking to your children, your preschool child, and there are similar kinds of guidelines for talking to older children. Okay, let me come to an end with a couple of thoughts and a concluding story. First of all, I can't emphasize enough. Resilience is the norm. All the studies show that if a kid is abused, we heard beautifully from Rabbi Zwickler how it could set your child on a trajectory that could be horrible long term, and that's all too true. But if you figure out how to really listen to them and believe them in the face of their coming to you, or just even to talk to them about it, the research shows is one person who cares becomes the immediate pathway to resilience. If you believe them and you protect them, that's all you need to do. I'm not saying they may not need therapy, but the norm is resilience if you're there at their side. I was very lucky to have Rav Palm as my Rebbe for a number of years when I was learning in the Beis Medrash in Torah V'das. And he used to tell us something that always stuck with me. He said the following. He said, when somebody is abused and you look the other way and you don't do what you need to do, among the many deoraisas, okay, the many biblical commandments that you are basically not being Mekayim, is the one of ha'alama, right? The Torah tells us if you see somebody going through a tough time and somebody's suffering and you look the other way and you don't help them, he said, that's a doraisa, salama. You don't have the right to pretend that you don't see it. You have to look at it and you have to deal with it and you have to stand at their side. As it says at the end of one of the Psukim on Halama, hakim takemim. You have to have their back. But then he said in his optimistic way, the beautiful way he always turned things around, he said, but you know what happens if you help such a child? You believe them, you give them words for their pain, you help them believe in themselves again, you give them safety. He says, among the many doraisas that you're Mekayim, among the amazing, amazing benefits you get from this, is the doraisa of Hashava Saveda, returning a lost object. So the obvious question is, what does that have to do with returning a lost object? He said, you know why? Because you're returning to them their lost soul. You're returning to them their lost soul. And that's what tonight's about. Tonight's about just being open and looking and taking it all in and recognizing this can happen. It's an unpleasant truth, but also resilience is the norm when you're at your child's side. And I see it all the time. I see abuse victims, sometimes victims of terrible abuse. And I get them in my office, or I see my colleagues get them in the office, or I see the work of the wonderful organizations represented here tonight, giving them support and help. And I see literally the light go back in their eye. You see their souls coming back to them. They look more alive. I'm sure you've all experienced this. Story. I'll end with the story. And then I have a lot stuck in my throat here, but I have to recognize the limits of a Monday night program, okay? Here's the concluding story. Number of years ago, I was invited to speak at a homeless conference. I was very excited. I thought I'd get to hang out with a bunch of homeless people in some parking lot somewhere. And I followed the address. Turned out it was the Waldorf Astoria, okay? And it was some kind of a big program for professionals dealing with the homeless. They're not nearly as interesting as it would have been to speak to homeless people, but what could you do? So I go in. There were two speakers. I was one of the speakers, but the other speaker, who was clearly the main speaker, we're both up on the dais. And I go up to the dais, and there's this very good-looking, very posh, amazingly well-dressed guy. But then I read his CV, and I figure I'm going home. I can't speak next to this guy. Here's what it says. It says, Dr. So-and-so has his PhD from Harvard, and it goes on and on to say about, he goes, he won an Oscar for a documentary he did on homelessness. He was in charge of homeless policy for the United States. He was like this superstar. And when he got up to speak, the first words out of his mouth were so unbelievable that I never saw an audience react. I think there were about 400 people there. Literally, just the first sentence out of his mouth, almost everybody fainted. I mean, it was unbelievable. Here was his opening line, this incredibly prestigious, supposedly privileged guy. He said, when I was 13 years old, my father, in a coked-up rage in front of me, killed my mother and then killed himself. How's that for an audience attention grabber? And he goes on to say, that he looked older than his age. He was living in a tough neighborhood. He knew what would happen to him. He didn't have any siblings. He knew he was going to end up in foster care. He knew foster care often is not a great life to live in that part of the United States. So he runs away. He immediately runs away. And he said for the next 2 years, he lived a totally meaningless existence. He'd go from homeless shelter to homeless shelter around the country. The second he thought they were on to him, he'd run away again. He didn't talk to anybody, had no connection. It was a life of total isolation by somebody way too young to be living a life of total isolation. And on top of that, somebody who had to deal with this horrific event. He said then, when I was 15, I ended up in a homeless shelter in Manhattan, and I heard 4 words that forever changed my life. And again, the audience is totally waiting. And he says, look, he says, you're going to be disappointed when you hear the 4 words. Because he says it wasn't those 4 words, it was the way they were said. I go into a shelter in Manhattan, and the director comes over to me, puts his arm around my shoulder, and he looks me in the eye. He says, how are you doing? He said, you know something? I saw in his eyes that he really meant it. He really wanted to know how I was doing. And somehow that did it. I started talking to him. And the more I talked, the more I wanted to talk. And he really wanted to hear. He said, for the next couple of months, I just spilled out my soul to him. And he saw not only did I desperately need to have a mentor, he saw that I was really smart. And he got me a scholarship, a full scholarship to the Dalton School in Manhattan. From there, I got a full scholarship to Harvard, and then from there, I ended up having a chain of events in my life that literally ended up with my standing here in front of you. 4 words, that's all it takes. And that's the bottom line take-home message. Prevention of child sexual abuse is really about that lesson. It's about the lesson of the Hakem Takem Imo, of being at a child's side and just being tuned in. That was the beautiful message of Rabbi Zwickler as well. It's, how are you doing? How are you doing? Okay? Being sure to be tuned in. Okay? Hopefully this will never happen to your children or to any other family member. But just being able to tune in, that kamayim panim al panim, eye to eye and heart to heart, is ultimately the best ingredient in terms of prevention of sexual abuse. So thank you, everybody. And what do we do now? Yeah? Yeah.